Hello and welcome to In the Making, a series of conversations from North Bennett Street School where we connect with a range of new voices, fields, and perspectives. Before we get into our conversation, I want to recognize and thank the Dora Foundation and Eaton Vance for making this program possible. Thanks for joining us, everyone. My name is Kristen Odell. I'm an NBSS staff member and host of In the Making. We are here at the home base of Michael Burrey, owner of MLB Restorations and an instructor in our preservation carpentry program. Joining us from Maryland is Blain Snipstal, founder, designer, and lead builder of Earthbound Building, a worker-owned construction company specializing in timber framing, custom carpentry, and natural buildings. Today, Earthbound Building incorporates the principles of ecological building, craft, and cooperative economics to their fundamental mission and practice. They believe that at the heart of the just transition and a sustainable food system lies infrastructure, affordable housing solutions, and buildings that are climate resilient, low impact, and beautiful. Other things we'll discuss in this program are the things behind me that are on Michael Burrey's property that he also uses in his low impact sustainable building practices and models. And the sun is coming in really hot now, so if you see me move around, just bear with me. Thank you. So I'm just going to jump in with a question that I'll start with Blain, and then we can ask Michael the same question. Both of your backgrounds are in farming. So Blain, I'll start with you. Your background is in farming. What core principles have you carried over from farming to building?
Hey, good afternoon, and thanks for having me. And thanks for dealing with my Zoom learning curve. Yeah, it's a beautiful autumn day. And my personal background in farming is, I guess, varied, if you will. I started farming, or started my journey into agriculture in my late teens when I think I was 16 or 17. I started working with a friend's father who had a nursery in California at the time. And I didn't think anything of it. It was just sort of summertime, wintertime work between the school sessions while I was in college or the last year of high school. But as the years sort of ticked along, I found myself totally in love with agriculture, really because it was the way in which I could find myself connecting more with nature. And spiritually, it really gave me a better sense of self. And culturally, it helped me to understand culturally kind of my ancestry and different ideas that had been sort of brewing in my mind. And so at that time, I was in California, and then I was in school in Kansas. And so I started farming full-time in Kansas. And then after I graduated college in 2010, I moved abroad. I moved to Nicaragua for a little while and was learning farming systems there, as well as Spanish, and how to be a better human in general. And that was the first moment when I really saw the connection between sustainable agriculture or natural farming, agroecology, and natural building or low impact building. Because while I was there in Nicaragua, it was the first time, and actually the only time I've ever seen people build a home with a plumb bob, a old school hand drill or hand crank, and a machete, and of course a hammer. It was one of the most incredible things still to this day that I've seen, and the construction industry produces a lot of really incredible things. And so that was sort of the first like aha moment that like, oh, okay, sustainable agriculture and agriculture in general, and low impact construction or natural building are actually intimately tied together. They're practically from the same seed or same fiber. And then over the years, I had the opportunity, because I was part of different agricultural organizations, to travel to 15 some odd different countries, basically from 2011 till my daughter was born 3 years ago. So I guess was that 2019. And I traveled Mostly I think to each continent, to Africa, to Europe, Asia several times, and then up and down Central and South America and the Caribbean. And while farming abroad, and then also farming here in the States between Kentucky and Maryland, and I was an itinerant farmer. And it was, and still is, has shaped basically how I see the world and how I've come to understand like my role as a human on this earth, and how now as a builder, basically how the threads could come together for my life personally, and then also with our co-op. And so all the while I don't farm full time as like my main occupation, I still consider myself a peasant, a small scale farmer. My partner, she's an herbalist and a farmer. And so we have a very vibrant homestead. And so it's still deeply sort of intertwined in my life, even though it might not be my principal occupation currently.
Mm-hmm. That's really, really wonderful. Michael, what would you say that you've carried over from your farming background into your practice now?
Well, there's a lot of inherent knowledge, I think, in farming. My background is more commercial. My mother was born and raised out in a small farming community out in Nebraska. So I spent a bunch of summers and 9 months after high school working on a family farm. But there's a lot of more construction techniques I learned from that. But it wasn't until I worked at Plymouth Plantation as an interpretive artisan, that's a 17th century living history museum in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And I was building palisades, fences, houses, gates, and thatching roofs. I think thatching roofs is and clay daub for the walls. So that's much more of a sustainable enterprise in those aspects. So we would go out in the marshes and cut cattails, dry them out, and use them for thatching material. I think that's, in terms of a sustainable material, it's something that grows every year. You've got Phragmites, you've got cattails, you've got wheat straw and rye straw that all can be used for, keeping a roof over your head. And if you put on properly, a thatch roof can last for 50 years or so. So those are the things that I've brought from, agriculture, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But also,
Blain, sorry, go ahead.
But also, just using clay for a base material for putting wattle and daub. Wattle is the sticks woven between two studs, and the clay daub is clay, sand, straw, sometimes manure, and worked up with your feet and put into the walls as an insulation material, sound material. But also, I've also traveled over to England and see cob houses, and I got excited about cob building. And I've Thatcher friend over there who's raises his own traditional wheats for thatching. So I did a lot of research into that.
Blain, I want to jump over to something that you've spoken about in your business model and on your website is, in your words, what is just transition, and how does earthbound building play a role?
Right. So I did want to go back, just take a step back a second to the last comment that Michael made, because it really lighted a fire in my mind a bit. It reminded me of a time when I was in Brazil, and I went there in that case, to study the way in which cooperatives had developed amongst farmers. And one of the most interesting things that I found on that trip was that the very first thing these groups of farmers did when they settled on land is they built 3 structures. They built school was the first one, the kitchen was the second one, and then like a meeting space was always the third building. And those were fully natural buildings. They harvested the site bamboo, and then we came in and we did wattle and daub, and then clay plaster, as Michael said. And you translate that over to Southeast Asia, farmers that I spent time with over there, because they have more timber that they're working with. Their homes are mostly post and beam framed, and because they're rice farmers, their insulation material might be a mixture of rice hulls, straw and clay, to have an abridged version of light straw clay. And then they're plastering their homes with a rice hull substrate mixed with clay or lime if they have that. And so that That's really important. I always like to highlight those connections because I think our model is not actually anything unique. It's actually trying to live on the inspiration of these farmers that I came across around the world, who are putting the principles and values of what could be a just transition or the society we need to be in into practice. And so the broad framework of the just transition comes out of the climate justice movement. And it's born out of the analysis of essentially framing the bad, of just understanding, developing the analysis around the current context of society. We know that the economic model of society can be called capitalism, and the political variant of capitalism is neoliberalism. And those forces together have more or less essentially reshaped the world as we know it. And in particular, it's had a very large impact on people and the planet, you know, if you were to truncate it down into a simple phrase. And so part of that is we know that the main industries within capitalism are the principal driving force behind climate change, that human-driven climate change is a fact, and that the predominant conventional industries, in particular agriculture, the extractive industries, and construction are some of the top three, or actually they are the top three polluting industries on the planet. And so couched within on that are these labor dynamics, the dynamics of businesses, the dynamics of people in relation to those systems of power within industry and also society at large. And so the just transition essentially says that we need to transition from this extractive, exploitative, and capitalistic model that fundamentally produces inequality and strips the planet of its native sources. We need to transition to a model that's based upon human dignity, that's rooted in the ecology of our local ecosystems, and has power and wealth and resources that are shared equitably. And that's an oversimplification of what is actually a very robust and complex set of proposals that different social movements are putting forward underneath the banner of just transition. And so if you were to sort of use one catch-all phrase, it's defunding the bad and funding the good. This idea that folks like Earthbound or these farmers that I've highlighted, probably even Michael's farm and Michael's experiences, we have solutions to some of these large macro problems, but actually at the root of it is that the resources, both financial and non-capital resources, aren't being directed to the frontline communities and groups that actually can make these changes possible so that we would all benefit from it. And so, you know, I wish I had a PowerPoint capability here, but I have a little visual to try to paint here to sort of localize this to the construction industry. So if you look at US energy consumption by sector, building operations are roughly 42% of all energy consumed. So the way we use our buildings is roughly half of the energy consumed in the country. Building construction and materials about 6%, and then transportation is about another 16%. And so one could argue that if the construction industry was able to make a substantiated pivot using the just transition framework, we could see a massive reduction in greenhouse gas emissions emitted from the construction industry and a shift in the way in which energy is being consumed inside of our buildings. And part of that is spurred on or is being led by, you know, the resurgence of the green building movement and of natural building and net zero and things like that, passive house. And part of the history of all of those threads is sort of born out of crisis, if you will. If those of us that may remember or have studied that in the mid 70s, there was the oil crisis that essentially hit the world. And when the concepts of peak oil came out, basically Europe, Japan, and North America said, oh, hey, cool, yeah, we're gonna run out of oil in about 2 years. So we need to rethink the way we design and build buildings, fundamentally at a broad, conventional or mass level. And so you get the passive solar movement the early iterations of the super insulation movement and sort of the roots of the passive house or Haus movement and the underpinnings of green building. And basically after 2 years, the oil crisis dissipated, and North America, the US in particular, broadly said, hey, yeah, there are these historic precedents of the green building movement and natural building and passive house and net zero that are born actually out of a root analysis of the need to transition from a petroleum-based construction industry and building methods. Although things have sort of become less radical over the years, we find ourselves couched within that. You know, we're a young company. We've been around since 2014. And in earnest, we had a rebirth in 2017. So by no means am I like an expert or a super like masterful person. I'm learning and trying to. But we are super inspired and want to inspire others to see the need for a just transition and how that can be reflected within the broader construction industry, because we, unlike a lot of other industries, we can build buildings or put things in place really fast that can have really long-term deleterious impacts on both people and the planet. And so the opportunity for us to make really long-lasting and impactful change in a very short amount of time is a tremendous opportunity for us. And so that's part of the reason we're super convicted to make sure that the buildings that we put up are as low impact as possible, using as much local materials, whether it's just a conventional timber framed building, making sure that we're keeping the lumber used within a 20 or 25 or 50-mile radius of our shop, which we're fortunate to have a woodland around us to do so. And then with enclosure systems, minimizing the amount of petroleum-based or foam-based products in our assembly, which can be challenging, and using more natural or regenerative materials or recyclable materials in the assembly. And there's many companies out here that do that. And so I'm like, I generally try to stay to the ground. So I just want to give a shout out to all the companies and groups and people out there that are doing awesome work too. And folks like the North Bennett Schoolhouse. It was great meeting Michael, I think, over the summer and picking his brain about all the fascinating decades of work that he's been doing cool things.
Mm-hmm. And we're gonna show you that in a little bit, Michael's lime pit, your own personal lime pit on your property. And Blain, I think you already tapped into this, but one of the questions that I had, or just for discussion, is building waste. You know, most of us, maybe not our guest here. There's chickens around me. Maybe not our guests here are probably very familiar, maybe familiar with the just the quietness of a green building site, you know, the timber framing sounds, just less noise pollution. And so I just want to pick both of your brains on what that means to you, just the waste in modern construction, both noise and material compared to green techniques.
Yeah, I mean, Michael, do you want to kick that off?
Well, in terms of waste, that's historic preservation is taking pre-existing buildings that a lot of them were built before fossil fuels and any sort of greenhouse gases were released. The only thing greenhouse gases were released from the oxen and the horses, pulling the logs out of the woods. So it's all water-powered sawmills that were converting the logs into boards, and hewn with axes and broad axes into usable timbers to cut into a timber frame. So over in England, I've visited houses that are built in the year 1250, and they're still houses, they're not museums. And there's a lot of those over there. So it's talking about sustainable building practices. That's it. So in historic preservation, that's what we're trying to do, is maintain those structures for another 100 years, 200 years, and keep them going by replacing sills, replacing rotted pieces, and get them up and running and livable for modern conditions. So in terms of waste, what I see so much of is everybody wants a new house, and so these wonderful 17th, 18th, and 19th century houses are getting demolished. In one town, Marshfield, in Massachusetts, there was 30 historic houses demolished in 1 year. and all that is ending up in landfills or in dumpsters and gone. Then you're looking at all modern practices for constructing new houses. So that's where I see a tremendous amount of waste in the modern construction era. And of course, when we do reproduce a timber frame, I try to use as many natural materials as possible, and all the offcuts are used for heating the shop or heating the house in a wood stove. And I try to use cellulose or wool is another good product, I think, that I've tried in terms of being sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
I also I'm just commenting my notes on just noise pollution. I mean, I live in a very condensed area. I work in a condensed area, Boston, and just as a a citizen of a city, it's just the noise pollution from construction everywhere is overwhelming, and I think about it all the time.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and there's scales of application. And so like we can think about it like what is waste? Did waste exist as a concept 1,000 years ago? Arguably, probably not in the way we conceive it today, because 1,000 years ago you didn't have extractive industries that were capable of harvesting materials out of the planet and then creating something that the planet then would have a very difficult time breaking down, i.e. foam and modern construction materials. So waste for us oftentimes is an opportunity to figure out how to reuse that either back into the building or to use it for the next building, or as a project management opportunity to, when you're doing your takeoffs or designing a building, how you design a building that minimizes the waste potential. Are some practical, applications. Oftentimes when you have buildings that have lots of different subs coming in and out of that building, one practice that we actually don't employ, but we certainly will start doing, we just learned from another company, is to set up a refuge or a waste upcycling area on the job site. So you've got one section that's for cardboard, one section for plastics, one section for foam, and then wood offcuts. And in our case, we actually upcycle our wood offcuts into heating our previous shop, and then that'll heat our shop to be. But the broader industry at large, waste is a big issue because, there's this new catchphrase that like, may our buildings last for 100 years. And, and Michael has highlighted how he's been in buildings that have lasted for 400 or 500 years. And I've been in barns that have been around for 200 or 300 years with maybe 1 or 2 renovations that have gone through that building. But I think the broader question is, should we be asking, in addition to can our buildings last 100 years, can the impacts of our buildings in terms of the energy required, the embodied energy required, and then the landfills that have to absorb our waste, the answer would be that all that lasts for 1,000 years. In foam and plastics case, it takes over 1,000 years for those things to actually break down. And so, the carrying capacity of waste on this planet is something that our construction industry, I know we don't spend a lot of time thinking of, but it's coming up against us here very quickly. And to your other point about tools, yeah, it's interesting. And noise pollution, we love traditional timber framing, using a chisel, a hand plane, a slick, and things like that. But the challenge is that how do we have a client that can pay for us, pay the labor costs associated to only use those tools? And the reality is that the clientele we work with are mostly farmers and community groups and relay people. And so, we're using production tools, and as much as possible, we want to use hand tools, but we also have to have this relationship with balancing noise pollution for ourselves, and then also trying to have moments of peace where you just hear the chisel or the axe across the grain or what have you. And obviously, you're building high rises and large scale construction. That's just not possible. You're not going to see someone with a with like a mallet trying to drive a 2-foot long steel rod into a steel building. Right.
Blaine, something that you mentioned when so for our guests, we were connected with Earthbound Building through a community member, but then Michael and I sort of coincidentally met you on the site of the Notre Dame Trust project. That's where we met sort of by accident in person. And so we spoke with you then, and one thing you were talking about was going back to something you just said about your clientele and how, not necessarily about your clientele, but how green building was at one point the method of building. So just the irony and the hurdles that you deal with now, that modern construction is cheaper than green building, and how your constant battle of selling that to people. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so building systems, if we're talking in parallel to the development of like sort of human societies, varied all over the planet. So in Europe and in Southeast Asia, you have access to woodlots. So i.e. the birth of timber framing, whatever it's traditional Japanese timber framing, or traditional European, Dutch, German, what have you, English, timber framing, versus here in North America and Central America, you have a varied forms of domiciles of buildings, whether they're wigwams or longhouses or teepees. And you go to Mongolia or South Asia and you have yurts and different types of structures. And so all of these different building systems developed within the vacuum of that local culture, and those local customs, as well as their relationship to the cosmos. And today we would call that natural building. But back then that wasn't natural building, that was just what it was. You built with the material. But in today's context, in a globalized society, people want to build any type of home anywhere in the world. So the resources and the locality of them are irrelevant in the context of the conventional construction industry. Natural building got its rebirth, if you will, at the same time as the early stages of the net zero and the early stages of the passive solar movement, and during the timber framing renaissance that was happening in the 70s, which was also a massive moment of sort of cultural upheaval in our society at large. And a lot of that birth of the natural building movement was sort of spurred on the how should I put this? The ability for farmers to now create essentially straw bales. Straw bales weren't a traditional natural building method prior to the early 1900s because, quite frankly, it was very difficult and virtually impossible to create square bales, because we didn't have the machinery at the time. And so, and I say straw bales because oftentimes people, when they think of natural building, they think straw bale building and they think cob building. And we often always try to deter anybody away from cob building that lives in our state, because it'll be a very uncomfortable home. Very labor intensive, but very uncomfortable because it's not actually insulative material. And so the biggest challenge that we find in terms of trying to quote unquote sell natural building or put forth a low impact construction methods with clients is their value system, because ultimately it's a values proposition. Because the conventional industry has become, much like conventional agriculture, is brilliant in their model. Essentially what they said around World War II and a little bit before was like, oh, well, how do we actually create a super standardized set of products that low skilled labor can be paid less, but can build these buildings really fast? And so we design buildings and mortgages around that idea. Mortgages last for 30 years because your home shouldn't last past 30 years because you got to renovate it. Well, we should design buildings on 4-foot increments, or 16, 24, 19.2 layout systems that can accept standard sheet good products. And the upside to that is that, yeah, we've learned how to build buildings really fast, really quick, and really inexpensively. But the downside to that is that inexpensive model actually is very expensive, because the true costs of production are externalized. The embodied energy, the amount of carbon it takes to produce OSB, is externalized. So when we see $32 for a sheet, we like that price, but in COVID, in some places, we saw $90 or $88 a sheet. And truthfully, if you did the true ecological cost of a sheet of OSB, you'd be actually looking at $100+ a sheet. Even though it's using a recycled wood, there's a massive amount of carbon that's pumped into a single sheet of OSB. And so when you run up to clients, the whole industry has had this marketing campaign for a better part of 60 years, and mortgages and everything around it, to make the conventional building system thrive. And so when you marry that to natural building, it's actually an unfair comparison. Partly because the material costs can be lower, but because there has been this 60+ year sort of excavation of highly skilled labor in the broad construction industry, you then now have very specialized skill sets required to do natural or green building, but in particular natural building. And so we kind of take a hybrid approach, so that we're able to build timber frames and cool buildings, but we'll take a hybrid approach. So oftentimes what that means is we might timber frame a portion of the building, and then that carries our principal loads of the building. And then we can have a 24-on center stick frame around it that carries dense packed cellulose, or we can wrap it with straw bales if the client so chooses. And so that hybrid approach has been successful for us. Of course, you have to make concessions as any small company and whatnot, so we're not purists by any means. But at a broader level, until there are broader forces within the industry at an industrial level or a commercial level that begin to push the envelope, natural building and green building will continue to be fringe endeavors, fringe methodologies. And obviously, like the passive house movement and new energy codes and net zero are the future of the conventional construction industry. You can't really talk about them being successful without also talking about the social impacts. And oftentimes you see net zero or cutting edge green buildings or green homes. And in the case of green homes, they're like $400 a square foot on average, or maybe 300 or high twos. And that then makes it almost impossible for you to have the conversation around affordable housing and affordable buildings within the context of green building. And so these are really like complex dynamics that are at play. And for us in our little microcosm, our motto is like, build simple, live simple. And so we try to build hybrid buildings that are simple enough that keep the cost down, but they're complex enough that allow the building to be beautiful and make sure that it would last, for as long as possible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And in a second, I hope we can see what you're building out on your property. But I'm going to switch this over to Michael. We just were talking earlier about Portland cement as a modern construction material that's terrible for the environment. And we're going to hear Michael's sort of personal solution to that with his multi kilns and brick kilns and lime pit here. So,
all right.
Talk to us about Portland cement, Michael.
Okay. Well, Blain might know a lot about the I don't know how much the percentages of carbon dioxide that's given off every year from the production of Portland cement. I am not that familiar with those, but you sound very knowledgeable in those figures. But there's a huge proportion of the construction greenhouse gases produced by Portland cement in the firing of it, the making of it, and the release of carbon dioxide. But what's been sustainable for 6,000 years is lime mortar. Just it's calcium carbonate. It's seashells, basically, either as limestone, marble, or the seashells themselves. That 44% of the weight of that calcium carbonate is carbon dioxide. But by firing that calcium carbonate to 1850 Fahrenheit, you drive off that carbon dioxide. You lose 44% of the weight of it. That becomes calcium oxide. So calcium oxide is very reactive in water, and you put in water, you slake it in water, you slake its thirst basically. There's a chemical reaction that happens, and then you turn it into calcium hydroxide. So what you can see in front of you, there are seashells, there's oyster shells, clam shells. In the bottom part of the photo video is limestone from Maryland, actually. Limestone is a good source of lime. Forward on the top part of it is offcuts from the production of countertops. And I think that's Carrara marble out of Carrara, Italy. That's a high calcium carbonate source material. So I raid the dumpster at the local granite countertop company, which they're very happy about. And I pull out their marble. And then what my plan is, because it's been very difficult to get quick lime, is to fire my own lime. And this, what you see now, is a gas-fired pottery kiln that was given to me by Jane Harold with Potter Friend. And it's about 12 cubic feet. So my plan is to use saggers or clay vessels to put in there and fire the lime, limestone, marble, and seashells, and create quicklime, because that's what's been difficult to get lately. The first ton of quicklime I bought was $250 a ton. The last ton of quicklime was $2,000 a ton, and it was $1,000. It came out of St. Genevieve, Missouri, and it was $1,000 for the ton, $1,000 to get it here in Massachusetts. And so there's also carbon dioxide released in that. So my idea is to fire it and create my own quicklime, slake it, and we're coming up to the lime pit now. This is a 6 foot diameter, 6 foot deep pit in the ground, so that once you slake the quicklime in water, there's a chemical reaction that happens. It turns into a putty. You dump it into the pit. There's a lot of leaves down in there, so it's a little hard to see. You dump it in the pit, and it matures, it ages. It's best to keep it a minimum of 6 years. The Romans would specify 5 years for aging their lime. And the longer it stays in the pit, the better it gets, as long as it stays wet. And the wetness of it keeps the carbon dioxide from moving back into the calcium hydroxide. So the particles that are in there, the seashell breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces, and it gets very fine material. So the longer it stays in that pit, the more those pieces break into smaller and smaller pieces, so the more plastic and workable it becomes, and the better quality. So
sorry, Michael, I'm just wondering if you should guide me here. Am I taking you here now?
Well, let's go up to the kiln.
Okay.
So, once the lime is sitting in the pit, then you use it as either lime plaster for haired lime plaster in walls, or mortar for chimneys, foundations, fireplaces, etc. That carbon dioxide that was driven off, that 44% of the weight, moves back into the calcium hydroxide and reforms calcium carbonate. So you drive off the carbon dioxide, but then it returns for the most part back into reform calcium carbonate. So it's a fairly low energy requirement for it. And my preference is to use wood. And what you have in front of you, this is a reproduction of a medieval English tile kiln. It comes out of I forget what part of England, but they used it to fire encaustic tiles, or the floor tiles, or in some of the monasteries, abbeys, cathedrals, etc. So this is a reproduction one. You could fire tiles, roof tiles, clay, floor tiles, bricks. That curved brick that Kristen showed you was fired in there. There's 762 bricks that I made. I want to make a round chimney. It's a local clay. I got my kids involved. We wedged up the clay. We threw it in the molds. I made the molds themselves and had a 36-hour firing. But you can also fire lime in it. There's a pile of marble off to the left that is left over from experimental burning of lime. It didn't work very well, but it's one of those things that you've got to do it a number of times before you're going to get it right. So the kiln itself is wood fired. It's got 2 fireboxes, and you alternate back and forth between stoking each firebox. The square portion of above is about a cubic yard in capacity. So you fill that with the pottery for the tiles, the bricks, or the limestone, marble, and it's usually about 36 hours to get it up to temperature using wood. So I don't know, I was trying my best for sustainable practices using the local wood, branches out of the trees, offcuts, scrap wood to fire the kiln. And it's a good group builder too. It's a very social occasion. You invite all your friends over and you make some haggis, which is what happened one of the times, and you have a good social occasion and stoke a kiln.
Thank you, Michael.
Yep. So you can see all my resource material back there. It's all recovered materials, hoping to find a new home again. There's timbers,
This is
there's
a
bricks,
treasure trove.
there's stone, there's too many things. Anybody see anything they like, let me know.
Thank you, Michael.
You're welcome.
I'm going to segue to sort of a broad general question that both of you can answer. What do you see as and you may have already touched on this already. What are in concise terms, what are the hurdles in the green building marketplace right now?
I guess I'll go. Yeah, I'll just speak for, I guess, our experience here. We actually, I don't know if this is a sound analysis, but we actually think the biggest hurdle in the green building marketplace is not enough companies who are willing to build that way. And we've floated that idea around because part of the reason that our conventional materials are so inexpensive is because everybody buys them. So there's this scale of economy here. And so for some of the green building methods and details and products, we're still in like what you would call the early adoption phase. And so in the early adoption phase, the cost of the materials are actually significantly higher than they would be in the full sort of rollout phase. And so if we were to see more companies that were willing to sort of drill down on their building methodology to be more ecological or green focused, that would be immensely helpful. One, for just driving the cost of the materials down, but also then we could see sort of this rebirth of the crafts, of trade groups, of different guilds that might be more localized. And so you can have this cross-pollination of knowledge. We're members of the Timber Framing Guild, and one of the biggest riches of being part of that Timber Framing Guild is just spending time with other like companies that had like experiences, and there's this immense sharing of knowledge and of wisdom. And then I guess at the macro level, to crack the code, which for us, we define the code as a building that is natural or low impact, that is financially accessible, and that is clean for both the inhabitants and the planet. We firmly believe that the only way that building methodology is actually going to be possible at scale is going to be support from either the state or from nonprofits that can essentially subsidize certain costs of that production model, whether it's tax credit incentives or abatements and what have you, because the conventional building industry and its materials receive massive amounts of government support and support from different entities to actually make that model even possible. And so it's hard to think that green building will be at scale without that support. And so those would be my comments.
And Michael, I want to hear your answer to this too, but you just, I remember something else you said that so it sort of takes the single person to popularize a green building situation, and then that tiers up to, at some point you get up to the federal level and federal support for green building materials. You mentioned that during the pandemic, you got a sort of a flurry of calls for green building. Is that correct? Because of people trying to keep their homes healthy.
Yeah. There's this valorization of like health and clean air in the context of our our built environment. And so for us, we started to get more calls than we could handle. And actually some of the projects where we're in the pre-construction design phase, when we were doing cost comparisons between different enclosure systems, well, during COVID, the cost of the conventional enclosure system exploded. And it made a straw bale system and a natural building systems actually quite affordable within that context, actually cost competitive. And so we were able to, in 2 cases, take 2 of our clients from a sort of a green building system using dense packed cellulose, which I really actually like dense packed cellulose, to moving towards a natural building system using light straw clay and straw bale as the enclosure. You know, with, in that case, to Michael's genius, we're gonna be using, I think, hydraulic lime as our exterior finish, just because of the environmental exposure. So yeah, that's been the thing. And a lot of my natural building and timber frame buddies and companies that we know, they saw the same sort of affect during the COVID years.
Yeah. So just wanting people, individuals wanting cleaner, breathable spaces to occupy. Yeah. Michael, what would be your, I mean, you're on the restoration end most of the time. What would you say is the biggest hurdle to this kind of green building marketplace?
Well, I mean, it's another aspect of green building, but all the existing buildings, because the carbon dioxide has already been released. The biggest hurdle is just people's interest in maintaining an old house. A lot of contractors have no clue about old houses. They get into them and they don't understand them, so they rip out everything that they don't understand and put in something they do understand. And a lot of it is work that is completely unnecessary. So the biggest hurdle I see is just there needs to be more practitioners out there who are familiar with historic preservation and know that, it's got a little bit of rot on it, but it's got a good core, so we can make use of that. We can repair it. We don't have to tear it apart and rip it out. So I think the biggest thing is just changing the mindset of, the clients, architects, and contractors who don't understand it on a fundamental level.
I'm just checking our time right now, and we're 10 minutes, we're 12 minutes too. So I just want to let everybody know that if you have questions for Blain and Michael, please type them into the Q&A box and I'll read them out to them. So just give us your questions. And while we're waiting for those, Blain, what are your biggest hurdles right now with earthbound building? I mean, you've already spoken to green building, low impact building, but specific to earthbound, where are you at now?
We're just trying to not get in our own way.
What does that mean?
Basically, we're, like I said, we started out in 2014, and then we really started to scale our work and sort of what we do as a company in 2017. So we're young. We're still just sort of new in the mix, new in the game. And you don't know what you don't know. And this year we've had last 2 years in particular, we've had tremendous learning curves. And so some of our biggest hurdles are just, lack of a better term, ourselves. Really taking the time to be thoughtful about our internal systems in terms of our SOPs and having our internal project files and the management systems together, because we have the skill and the expertise to build any building that we're asked to build. But in terms of how we actually manage that comfortably, so it's right for our bodies, because the average age of our crew, I think, is 32. Yeah, 32. And so there's still this balance of we can just sort of work really, really hard and just kind of just muscle our way through situations. And then on the other side of that is then your body's destroyed afterwards. And so how do we think smarter and work smarter? And that's both on a job site workflow and then also how we manage our projects. Those are our biggest hurdles, because we don't do any marketing, and I'm no good with technology. I'm no good with technology.
You're doing great.
So all the work we get is word of mouth. And so quality dictates that, and we feel comfortable with how our quality sits up in the world. It's just a matter of making sure that we're operating our co-op in a way that is fiscally responsible, but also responsible to like our bodies and our lives, because we're builders, but that's not the only thing we are. And so having space to have balance is still one of our biggest hurdles.
Mm-hmm. I have a question for each of you. Did you start out with a personal sense of wanting being a low impact person, or was there as a child, or was there something that happened in your life that was like, oh, this is not right, I'm making a change right now? Michael?
Oh, well, my father's an architect, so I've been on building sites since I was a little kid. I don't know, the pivotal moment was when I was 13. I picked out a book by Eric Sloan, American Barns and Covered Bridges. And, he's an author, but kind of an amateur historian, where he's chronicling the past and the trades of the past and the hewing and the barns and the houses that they were building, et cetera. And it's something that really spoke to me. I certainly didn't connect it with the green building movement then. But I got interested in historic preservation and learning those techniques of hewing and riving and treadle-powered lathes and various things like that. And started doing those sorts of things, and it gradually morphed into an occupation, which I never expected to happen. But then, as the green building movement got started, it occurred to me that historic preservation is one of those aspects of green building, along with straw bales and timber framing, new timber frames, et cetera. So that's one of my selling points to people who talk about, well, should I demolish the house or should I keep it and repair it? It's always look, this is it's a green house to begin with, and change it, modify it for modern needs, but let's keep the basic structure.
Mm-hmm. Blain?
Yeah. Yeah, shout out to that book that Michael mentioned. Eric Sloan has actually written dozens of books, and that's actually I think one of my favorites of the ones that he's written.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book.
It's so awesome. Yeah, I grew up in like a modest working class family. Raised by my grandma. She put me in the Boy Scouts at an early age, and we always shopped at the thrift store, not because it was cool, just because that was just the reality of it. So I've always had, like, I guess in me, sort of like a frugal material conservation ethos, but it didn't really crystallize till I was farming. And oftentimes on farms, or actually all the time on farms, I was doing the majority of the carpentry or construction projects. And if anybody grew up in farm country and knows farmers, that there's a way to do things, and then there's the farmer way to do things. And that oftentimes is very like bootstrapped and scrappy, and you just work with what you got. And so that was sort of an ethos that I got, in my late teens and in my early 20s. And
you sort of both answered it. That it was the question of low impact building, but more just were you born with this responsibility to tread lightly? And I think you both answered that. And I ask it from the perspective of a non-timber framer or non-preservation carpenter, where, I'm just a civilian, I, like somebody like me will recycle, or, be as green as possible, be a one, old car family sort of situation. You two take it to the next level. You were actually in the infrastructure, like green infrastructure business. And so, were you, I guess that's the question is, and you already answered it, is were you sort of born wanting to be a light treader on this planet? I think you both answered it.
Yeah, I definitely was, because I've been frugal as well from day one, and you can see by what's behind Kristen and all that yard is definitely trying to save as much as possible.
Yeah. I have a question from a guest. Let me try to find it here. It's do you have any suggestions for workarounds, like working around modern construction techniques, and how you can communicate with a client, for instance? So any good applicable workarounds for modern construction code, and any strategies for talking to clients that might be hesitant to employ these types of practices?
Go ahead, Michael.
I don't know. I think you might be better to answer that question. Because I mean, in terms of historic preservation, pre-existing houses are not really subject to code. You do the best you can to build it up, bring it up to code if you need to, as long as you don't go over a certain percentage of the value of the house, or the house, I believe. So I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the context of like new construction, because we exclusively do new construction. We do historic barn repairs, but we'd love to do more of that, but it's a little few and far between where we live. We typically have to travel to the northern part of the state to do that work. So we're mostly doing new construction, but most of our colleagues do renovation or green or deep green retrofits and remodels. And so a lot of the times the opportunity for the workarounds start when you have the design set. Pre-permit submission or even post, but if you can get it pre-permit submission, then you have opportunities to make some VE or value engineered suggestions. One tool that we use, which is somewhat exhausting, but it's really helpful, is we just don't know what we don't know. And so oftentimes to help a client get to the opportunity of realizing how much they might want a natural home or a clean home, there's a tremendous amount of education that we have to do together. And we find that if the client is on board and understanding, at least on a fundamental level, of our building method that we would like to build for them, once they have that understanding, oftentimes they make the value statement or the value judgment that, oh, well, it might be a little bit more, or maybe it's not a little bit more, but this actually gives us a higher quality of living, a safer home or a safer building if there's a conditioned or an enclosed space. But if you're just getting to the design set, I would just say, a lot of it's in the details. Like I spend a lot of time getting design sets from architects and engineers, and we spend a lot of time just putting on red lines all over the documents, asking basically, can we change this detail? Can we move the steel here, because steels or metal base element, if not iron, is bauxite, which doesn't come from the US. And so if we can remove steel from places and use, in our case, traditional wood joinery, that's an advantage. Or if we can remove foam from the conditioned assembly and maybe just keep it underneath the slab, or put it in a roof if you're doing a hot roof, and so forth. So we try to find the opportunities early on in the design set to sort of intervene and provide examples of how it could be built differently. And one line we drew in the sand is that we actually don't take projects that we can't have design influence. We learned several years ago that it just made the building process really challenging when we didn't have a vested stake in how the design was put together. And so now we are just very upfront with anybody we work with that we have to have some level of participation in the design of the building.
Mm-hmm. Something you just said, Blain, is just really relates to everything that we teach at North Bennett in all of our programs. Is just everything is hand skills based, everything is handmade, and that's one of the challenges we live with in this culture is educating people on the value of the long term, the longevity of an object, and getting away from fast homes, fast clothes, fast instruments. I really appreciate that.
Yeah. No, I just was on a call the other day, and I guess the founder of this company called Big Meister, and he was talking about a study he was reading from some behavioral economists And basically the study essentially said that human beings were sort of hardwired to be optimistic about schedules and timing. And the study was sort of rationalizing why carpenters and the broader building industry, there's this big push to build things as quickly as possible. And like part of it is psychologically, you know, today we're kind of hardwired to want things quick, fast, and cheap. And to slow down, to take your time, and to realize that something that is cheap is actually a economic concept, but not an ecological one, you know, changes your relationship to building in general.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. We're now at our time, and so I'm going to wind this down, and I just want to thank you both for spending the afternoon with me and us at North Bennett. And thank you to our guests for being patient with all of the tech situations here. I've been sort of chasing the sun over here. And thank you both, Blain and Michael, for letting us crash your home. And I really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you very much, Kristen. And Blain, has been fantastic being able to get to know you better and what you're doing. It's you doing some very interesting work, and I'd love to go down that path too. But
yeah, it would be great to work together again. And yeah, thanks again, Kristen. This has been awesome. And Michael, hopefully one day I can get to like play with your kiln and learn all about slaking and all this stuff. That'd be so
come
cool.
on up. I'll show
come
you
on
around.
Up, please. Yeah, come here. Well, Michael, come to see Michael, but you should come to see us at North Bennett Street School.
Yeah,
that'd be great.
Yeah, and thank you to our guests for being with us today, and we'll see you all at the next In the Making.
Okay.
All right, take care. Bye, everyone. Bye.